Race and Racism in Foucault by Robert Bernasconi. Although Foucault's account of race thinking and of the history of racism is somewhat sketchy, it has proved seminal for at least 5 reasons. First, his idea of biopolitics has proved highly productive for isolating the specific kind of racism that led to the Holocaust. Second, by understanding race in terms of the biological existence of a population, and by tracing that concern back to the 18th century, 1700s, and the emergence of a discourse of population that monitors birth and death rates, and where sex became a police matter, Foucault gave new significance to the growth of Polizeiwissenschaft in Prussia in the 18th century, 1700s, and in particular to the work of Heinrich Gottlob von Giusti and Johann Peter Frank. This has borne fruit in a number of historical studies. Third, Foucault's general approach is well suited to what has been called the polyvalent mobility of the concept of race, in the sense that it is continually shifting or being reinscribed. For example, Foucault described how the Nazis combined state racism with a revival of the legend of warring races. Fourth, Foucault's revival of the idea of a race war has proven illuminating in other contexts, such as political theory and geography. Finally, and most controversially, Foucault is seen as having offered an account of racism that allows its broadening to the point where it can be applied to describe prejudice against all those considered by society to be abnormal. Even though Foucault had at his disposal the resources to write a new account of the history of the concept of race, not least because of the work he had already done in The Order of Things, where he described the shift from natural history to biology at the beginning of the 19th century, 1800s, he chose not to do so. According to the original plan for The History of Sexuality, Foucault intended the 6th, final volume to be on populations and race, but he abandoned the idea. On another occasion, Foucault announced his ambition to trace the full development of a biological social racism, but he stepped back from this too. What he did do was show that in the French context, the early 18th century, 1700s, historical discourse of races, associated most notably with Henri de Boulainvilliers, was transformed into the theory of races in the historical biological sense in the second quarter of the 19th century, 1800s, and then linked with evolutionism. He organized this account around a distinction between racism in its modern, biologizing, statist form, which he sometimes presented as being organized around the idea of racial purity, and racism in the traditional sense of the term, or as he called it in the final lecture of the course Abnormal, ethnic racism. However, the fact that with few exceptions, he virtually ignored race-based slavery and the specific place of race in colonialism and imperialism has led to the charge that his account is provincial, in the sense that it belongs to a historiography locked in Europe. Nevertheless, this has not stopped a prominent African thinker, Achille Mbembe, from using Foucault's notion of biopower to illuminate colonial occupation. Foucault was not writing a history of racism in the conventional sense, but a genealogy, which he defined early in the 1976 lecture course as a coupling together of scholarly erudition and local memories, which allows us to constitute a historical knowledge of struggles and to make use of that knowledge in contemporary tactics. It is in these terms that Foucault's work must finally be judged. He chose to begin his account with Boulainvilliers because of the latter's impact on the development of a specific brand of French racism that flourished at the end of the 19th century, 1800s, and that continued to have echoes in the France of his day. Foucault believed that racism was indispensable to the functioning of the modern state. Death of the inferior race will make life healthier and purer. And at the time, it was a genuine question for Foucault as to whether biopower could function without racism. At one point in Society Must Be Defended, Foucault provocatively reserved the term racism for a period that began at the end of the 19th century, 1800s. Although he conceded later in the same lecture course that there had indeed been prior racisms, the discrepancy is explained by the fact that Foucault's focus throughout was on state racism. Nor was this decision to locate racism so late entirely without precedent. Hannah Arendt drew a distinction between race thinking and racism that had the same effect of dating the advent of racism to the second half of the 19th century, 1800s, although, unlike Foucault, She showed a strong interest in the racism of imperialism. As with Foucault, Arendt, relying on French scholarship, highlighted Boulainvier, but for Arendt the crucial figure was Count Arthur de Gobineau, whereas for Foucault it was Benedict Augustin Morel, the author of Traité des dégénérations physiques, intellectuelles et morales de l'espèce humaine, 1857. Foucault argued that Morel transformed the notion of degeneration in such a way as to prepare for what came to be known as the eugenics movement. Morel's focus was on the way that the sins of the parents are visited on their children. Although the children of alcoholics may not themselves be alcoholics, through inheritance they nevertheless come to suffer deformities or other problems. It was because Morel invited societies to address the potential dangers that Foucault was able to give him such a central place in the history of biopolitics. Foucault is said to have understood biologizing racism very broadly insofar as he employed it to cover all forms of degeneration, including alcoholism. The main basis for this claim is the assertion in Abnormal, where Foucault described a new racism that is not so much the prejudice of one group against another as the detection of all those within a group who may be carriers of a danger to it. It is a racism that permits the screening of every individual within a given society. In that context, he wrote of a racism against the abnormal, against individuals who, as carriers of a condition, a stigmata, or any defect whatsoever, that is hereditary. It is quite possible that Foucault meant simply to show the broadening of what were conceived of as hereditary traits, but some commentators have extended Foucault's concept of racism to include, for example, not only mental deficiency and mental illness, but also so-called sexual deviance. To be sure, at one point in Society Must Be Defended, albeit without explicit reference to Morel, he refers to all those biological racist discourses of degeneracy, dégénérescence, but also all those institutions within the social body which make the discourse of race struggle function as a principle of exclusion and segregation and, ultimately, as a way of normalizing society. It is not altogether clear why Foucault was so insistent on calling this a racism, except perhaps to anticipate the way the two technologies, the technology of eugenics and that of psychology, came together in National Socialism. Although Foucault's account of the history of the various concepts of race and of the history of racism lacks detail, its importance for the development of his own work, as well as for subsequent scholarship in critical philosophy of race, cannot be doubted. It was at the heart of his claim that, at the beginning of the second half of the 19th century, 1800s, a long prepared-for shift took place when sovereign power, organized around the sovereign's power to take life or let live, was complemented, and to a certain extent displaced, by what he called biopower, a term he had used already in the first volume of the History of Sexuality, to refer to what brought life into the realm of politics as an object of explicit calculation, where what was at stake was not the life of the individual, but of large units of population such as races, nations, or even the species as a whole. Biopower was manifested in a new right that was attributed to the state, the right to intervene to make life or let die. Among the ways in which this new right of the state to let die manifested itself was through genocide and the discourse of eugenics, and racial hygiene, where it is a question of eliminating biological threats to the population, particularly those associated with race mixing. These discourses around racial hierarchization and race mixing were ways of fragmenting the biological continuum of the human species. The fragmentation was most pronounced in the way the discourse of race struggle became the discourse of a centered, centralized, and centralizing power, to become the discourse of a battle that has to be waged not between races, but by a race that is portrayed as the one true race, the race which holds power and is entitled to define the norm, and against those who deviate from that norm, against those who pose a threat to the biological heritage. Racism comes to be defined as a way of introducing a break into the domain of life between what must live and what must die. The terms in which this was done help to explain Foucault's broadening of the concept of racism to the extent he does. A whole politics concerned with the family, marriage, education, social hierarchization, and property, accompanied by a long series of permanent interventions at the level of the body, conduct, and health, finds its justification in the mythical concern with protecting the purity of the blood and ensuring the triumph of the race. What Foucault himself understood by race is not clear, but the best indication is to be found in his review in Le Monde in October 1976 of Jacques Ruffier's De la biologie à la culture. Only one of the 4 parts of the book was devoted to race and racism, but Foucault chose to focus on that part. He noted that, according to Ruffrier, race is now understood by biologists as a population, which is a statistical concept and must be understood in terms of genetics, not morphology. Furthermore, there have never been human races as such, but only a process of raciation, which is in fact negative insofar as any tendency toward racial purity reduces the possibility of adaptation. Here, Foucault finds a way to link his account of racism in terms of a discourse of populations going back to the 18th century, 1700s, with the current talk about populations in biology, but in such a way that biology might liberate us from the concept of race that it gave us. It is only a hint, but it seems that one might find here Foucault's own answer to his question of whether we might be liberated from biopolitics.